Jin Kim is the CEO of Miracle, and today we're going to talk about accelerating clinical trials with automated insights. Jin, welcome to CC Life Science.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris.
I'm excited about this one. This is a little bit different, but I want to learn more about this application. So, for context, tell us about your company, Miracle, and what you are doing in the clinical trials, ClinOps
Yeah,
space.
absolutely. My name is Jen Kim, CEO and founder of Miracle. We are working with biotech companies to integrate all of their clinical trial systems into a single automated real-time dashboard solution and surfacing insights that can help streamline and optimize clinical trials. So, for instance, a few of our customers running phase two, phase three trials have been able to finish studies 3, 4 months ahead of scheduled timelines. So, protecting precious, valuable runway, especially for the leaner biotech companies. I founded this company 2.5 years ago, and in my prior life, I used to work in enterprise sales, working closely with some of the larger big pharma companies like Biogen and BMS, GSK on exactly this kind of problem, working on how do you overcome data silos? How do you get the most out of the data that you already have? The key difference between big pharma and the smaller, leaner biotech companies is manpower and resources. And I think that's where the problem exists in both categories, except one has the manpower and resources to draw that out. Whereas for the leaner biotech teams, it's either you figure out how to run your studies on time or the company shuts down. And I think that's where we really try to help the smaller teams get the most out of the data that they already have.
Yeah. All right. So, we had a previous conversation. You described for me that clinical trial operations is a data problem. So, what kind of inefficiencies do you typically uncover in these companies you're working with that they wouldn't have discovered? Or
No, I wouldn't have I wouldn't say wouldn't have discovered. I think it's a well-known fact that everyone knows this, that in clinical trials it's largely powered by Excel. Um, and and I can see why, right? It's a free application that comes free with every computer. It's a very low-hanging fruit. It's a no-brainer. Everyone can use it. It's so easy to work with. But I think where it gets tricky is for small studies, I think that's fine. And for some very small teams, I think that's fine. But as you begin to do a phase two, phase three study, and you're beginning to work with electronic data capture, IRT, central labs, sometimes you have recruitment vendors, you got CROs coming into the mix, and as the number of systems that you're using in the study grows, now you have all of these different data silos. And so a classic example is in the EDC, you might call something data randomization. And in central labs, it might be called randomized data. Now, you and I can see that and know that it's the same thing, but systems don't. And I think when someone from the clinical operations team is trying to create comprehensive reports that you're reporting out to the entire company and the entire team, you're going to have to go into each system, export all of these data, and find a way to combine it into a single view. And that's where there's a lot of difficulty in. One, you're doing all of that manually. So it takes a lot of time to log in and dig for that export button and get the CSV. But the second part is how do you normalize it? How do you standardize it into a view that you can actually put the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different data systems together into a single view? And so I think that's where you're also expecting an industry of largely scientists, researchers, and medical folks who are not your Google, Microsoft engineers, and you're being forced to work with, legacy systems and very difficult to use systems. And that's the pain point that I've seen is you got to let data do its work. The data's there, and the best way to let data do its work is let the systems talk to each other, build out the integrations, bring them all and consolidate them and normalize them into a common format that in a way that the data talks to each other. And then you can create visualizations and dashboards and, even, a common view for everyone to understand, regardless of where the data is coming from.
right, is the concept of fair data relevant for this conversation? Do you know what
Fair
I'm talking about?
data, I don't think it's, actually it is somewhat applicable, right?
Yeah, I only mentioned it because I know next to nothing about it. I did a podcast with somebody about it a couple of years ago. When you talk about naming, for example, on a spreadsheet, are we all
Yeah,
using the same nomenclature for how we're talking about things? But it sounds like your system is designed to, one, not even have that happen probably, but even if in the case where, one entity names, as you say, randomized data or data randomization,
right.
then somehow your system is figuring out these are the same things. We should look at them
Exactly.
the same way.
Exactly. And so really, I think it goes into that eye of FAIR, right? Interoperable, making sure that the data that you have really talks to each other, meaning data randomized versus randomized data, right? They mean the same thing. So make sure that when someone looks at a comprehensive report, right, you're looking at it without having to figure that out separately.
So I'm curious just about the mechanics of this, since let's talk about multiple entities who would have had their own spreadsheets. Are they still
Right.
doing their own spreadsheets and those get fed into your system? Or it would seem the ideal thing is the sponsor, the biotech, has this system and says
Right.
everybody should log into this thing.
Yeah, I mean, Excel is a great tool, don't get me wrong, and they are a very formidable tool, and it's very easy to use. And how our customers and how our sponsors have been leveraging Miracle is, a lot of these systems, they got APIs or data transports or data exports already available. So by being able to tie upon that, piggyback on that, and be able to consolidate all the data into a single platform first, and then normalizing that data, right? So by doing that, we're essentially, as they call it, some sort of an AI agent where instead of you, right, the clinical operations or data management, the person at the biotech company having to do all of this manually, right? We define that rule once and we are able to have that process be automated. So let's say it took 1 to 3 hours. Let's say it took a couple of hours to create some sort of a study overview report by having to log into each system, copy paste the export, and create that view. But now, and because it took a few hours, you might have done it once a week or maybe twice a week, if your teams are super on top of it. But if you get those reports every Wednesday, then how do you know what's going on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, right? And then now with Miracle, we're able to provide, as an example, multiple updates throughout the day. So if a problem occurred on Thursday or Friday, and before you really didn't surface it until next Wednesday, right? Now in Miracle, you can not only see it, but you're also freeing up that time that used to be wasted on compiling this. And so you're not only freeing up that time, but now you can more proactively jump on issues as they occur. And through that, I think that's how some of our customers have been able to save and finish studies 3, 4 months in advance. But to be fair, a lot of sponsors, they're already in touch with sites, right? They're not only relying on these systems, they're on phone, they're texting, they're emailing. And so it very might well be the case that, sponsors already knew of these issues and a lot of these reports that come once a week, right, might have just been something to be like, oh, did we miss anything? But that is a big thing, right? If you missed
Right.
anything and you find out a week later, now the issue's a week old. So you just can't have any of those blind spots. And especially for the leaner teams, what we're saying is you can't have any blind spots like that. You need to make sure if an issue comes, right, just because a site didn't tell you or you didn't know about it, that can't be an excuse, because for the lean biotech teams, you run out of money, you don't finish the study in time, everything shuts down. So I think that's where you got to optimize every little bit from the data that you already have.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so you recently went to the AWS Life Science event. I'm curious what stood out to you about how companies are or are not thinking about AI and its role in operations.
Yeah, so I attended the AWS Life Sciences last May in New York. AWS invited us and also recently featured Miracle on how we've been impacting and innovating in clinical trials. And some of my biggest takeaways from that conference, it was mostly mid to large pharma companies that were in attendance with some of the bigger tech players in this. And quite honestly, most, if not all of the event was about AI. And I think there is a lot of focus and emphasis coming from big pharma saying, we have a lot of data, we need to use AI, and we need to find a way to make drug development more efficient, right? And it's not just clinical trials, it's drug development as a whole, starting from drug discovery to R&D, clinical trials, everything. And I think the key takeaway that I really took away was everyone knows that AI depends on data. And it's a big problem that data is still silent, right? AI is only as good as the data that you have. But if you have, say you're analyzing some real world evidence data, right? And you have data in one database super clean, but the other ones are a little different format, right? Or some more cleaning needs to be done, and none of these data systems are connected. And if your AI is powering off just that one data set, is it really telling you that big picture and the comprehensive picture of everything that you need to know? I think the answer is most likely no. And so I think that's why I think even as AI is going on, I think more and more companies are now realizing is we have a huge data problem. And in order to use AI, we need to have the AI or the data infrastructure ready to be able to properly use AI. And I think AI has been a good catalyst for companies to, step up its game in getting the data infra ready, in addition to ramping up their AI initiatives. And I think now, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, so it sounds like, I mean, if I am understanding right, part of your solution is to help them get those disparate data sources ready for whatever other AI they might run it through. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. So while the smaller biotech companies that we work with has been focused on delivering insights related to surfacing what's going on in their clinical trial, some of the larger pharma companies that we are talking with is thinking about, well, now how do we really use Miracle to become that data infra so that we can bring in all of the different data systems that they have, right? All the different data sets into a single platform, a common data model, so that you can really leverage the most of AI.
Yeah. So looking retrospectively, not like a clinical trials where we're looking every day at what's happening now, but like we have all this backload of data that we don't even know
Yeah,
what it might inform us about, right?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
How do you, this came up in a conversation with that I had with someone else this week, approach conversations with companies that are wary of AI. The issue that came up in my conversation was a concern about bias in the training data. And
Yeah,
I was asking sort of a similar thing, like, I make content, and honestly, ChatGPT gave me the idea. I was talking about like
yeah,
how can you use it not for generating content, but an inventory. So data that you
mm,
have of
yeah,
already published content, and you'd say, what are some themes in here that we haven't really uh, threads we haven't pulled on much, or how can we
right,
create something new and novel out of insights we have but haven't been the main thing, for example.
right,
Anyway, um, I'll let you go there. Like there must be
right.
some
So
resistance somewhere.
yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think as much as AI is all over the news and it's all over, I think it's the only word I see, right? DCT used to be a thing not too long ago, but that's nowhere to be found. And AI is all over posters when you go to conferences these days. And you're right, there's a lot of skeptics, and rightfully so, right? Because anytime there's a new buzzword, everyone quickly jumps to it. And what's next?
The trough
I
of
do
disillusionment, right? That's what's next.
exactly. Exactly. So I do think, at least in the conversations that we have with companies, right, biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies, I personally really put AI aside and really think about what's the problem at hand, right? And it should be, if AI is the right fit for supercharging that solution, I think that's the right fit. That's the right place where AI should be introduced. But if not, I think just trying to throw AI everywhere and seeing where it sticks, I personally really don't agree with that approach. mostly because I think especially in healthcare and especially in pharma and clinical trials, there's already set workflows on and how people have run these processes for decades. And it's been that way for a reason because it works and people are used to it and um it's how people have done things. And so I think it really starts with really understanding those intricacies of why it's been done that way, how each of the users, right, starting from clinical operations to data management, medical, or even going all the way to leadership, seeing what each of their workflows are and needs are and pain points are in clinical trials. And then thinking about, okay, is there a place where AI can supercharge that? And, quite honestly, the answer could be yes, especially when you're thinking about now that you have all the data in Miracle, right? And you're trying to forecast when are you most likely anticipating data readout, right? And so that's, I think, where naturally you can definitely begin to think about using AI. And I think by being able to tackle the pain point and the challenge at hand, as opposed to focusing on AI, I think that's been a great way for us to have conversations with our users and our customers. So solving the problem, not just throwing AI and seeing where it sticks.
You make that case very clearly. I mean, I always think like, and it's easy. You look at something like AI, and the first thing in your mind is, how could I use it?
Right.
When the real question is, where do we need to, and what are the problems we have? Which of these would
Exactly.
it be the correct solution for?
Right. Which is key.
Right. Yeah, it's key. I mean, there's an infinite number of things you could do, and it doesn't mean they're wrong or bad, but it might not be the right priority, and
Right.
following. Yeah, I mean, I spent
Yeah.
some time, playing with it to see what's possible to get
Right.
ideas, but yeah, I like to apply it when there's an actual solution. Okay, so when your non-technical users are your end users to a large degree, it sounds like, how do you
Yeah,
design the
absolutely.
tools so that they actually get used? Which is, of course, I'm sure a concern of yours as well as the people who are paying for it.
No, absolutely. My personal philosophy is if you build a product, your users better use it. And that might sound straightforward and obvious, but I found that sometimes tools get made just because it sounds cool and no one
Yeah.
really uses it. So it's really important that as we continue to build out Miracle and add on new features, it always comes back down to who is our end user, right? And I think earlier I loosely mentioned clinical operations, data management, leadership. I don't think it's enough to even just stay there. I think it's so important to get down into how is the director of clinical operations using it versus the actual people on the clinical operations team versus even, calling it leadership, how the chief medical officer is using it might be different from how the CEO is using it, right? And their needs and what people are looking at are very different. So I think it's super important to nail down who exactly is the ICP, right? Who exactly is that persona? Map out how do they go about their day, right? And for the CEO, they might be looking at some of these updates once or twice a week, but maybe the director or head of clinical operations might be looking at these updates, 6, 7, 8 times a day, right? So depending on that, right, is how we really begin to think about catering the experience to each of those different roles and personas. Um, and I think as much as clinical trials, I mentioned that there is a huge data problem, but we're not working with the Google, Microsoft, Amazon engineers in this industry, right? This is largely a research-oriented industry who might not know how to write Python or SQL code, nor should we, and we shouldn't expect them to. And I think that's where it's really important to figure out, well, what's the best way to help the non-technical users in the research space still get the most out of the data so that they can have the insights to run clinical trials and find ways to optimize and save time in clinical trials.
Yeah. So do you have workflows for all those different levels, like the people in clinical ops, the director, the leadership?
Yeah, I mean, over time now, as we've been working on more and more studies, we're powering studies across, phases 1, 2, 3, US and global studies, and now Parkinson's, autism, rare diseases, cardiovascular, so forth. We've been able to really flesh that out and cater that experience for each of those different roles, right? Because the metrics that leadership team cares about, at the end of the day, everyone's trying to finish the study on time and have good data for a good data readout. But on the daily basis, what metrics people are looking at could differ. And so, we have been able to build out the best practice metrics that each of the roles should be focused on throughout the course of the study.
Nice. So if someone is listening to this and they work at a biotech and they think, I don't even know what I'm missing, what should they ask themselves? How do they find what the problem that we were talking about, a
Yeah,
question ago?
that's a good question. And I think for most biotech companies and the smaller biotech companies, perhaps working towards their first FDA drug approval, I think the first key question that's on everyone's mind is, are we going to finish our study on time? And in parentheses, are we going to finish on time before we run out of runway and run out of money? And I think I would work backwards from that question to think about, in order to finish on time, what are the biggest risks? And oftentimes it could be enrollment, right? Actually, in fact, I think enrollment is one of the biggest factors. And I'll try to work backwards for, do we have the right metrics to be thinking about enrollment as an example, right? And so if you're thinking about, is our enrollment on track to finish the study on time, right? You're looking at number of screenings, or screen failure percentage, randomization, all the way down to how many people drop out in the study and ultimately complete the study. So I think you can do some back of the envelope math to figure out how many people are screening every week, how many people are screen failing, and how many of those actually randomized that week, right? And you can start to get some idea of, how many more weeks you will need to finish the study. And so I would try to think about those and try to overlay that with the metrics that you have internally as a team, and then continue to break out the risks. I do think that, for leaner teams, Excel is always a great place to start. And I think part of it is knowing what metrics to ask and think about. And obviously, if any teams need help, we're more than happy to help.
Yeah. Okay, this is a bonus question. Just crossed my mind, and I can't remember if I talked to somebody about this or not. But when you talk about recruitment, and I
Yep.
have some recollection of a conversation with somebody about placing ads for recruitment
Yep.
on Facebook or something. So you have those metrics and you see a certain rate. I mean, I guess this certainly, I don't expect it to be part of your solution,
Right.
but helping a company think about, maybe we should spend a little more money to accelerate
Yeah.
that process.
No, and that's a good question. And you're right. We don't do the actual recruitment, but we have worked with biotech companies on helping them at least see the end-to-end conversion from how much they're spending on ads, how many people are seeing those ads, and ultimately it's to drive the number of screenings, right? A lot
Right.
of these online recruitment strategies is geared towards, let's put those ads out there so that potentially eligible folks would go to your study website, learn more about your study, and if they're interested, they would be taking some sort of an online questionnaire to, see if they would be eligible, right? And they might have a little bit of a pre-screening process there until they're in touch with a site. But when you're running ads, right, Instagram, Google, Facebook, that's already 3 different systems that you got to be looking at. And you got to then track, how much did you spend? How many impressions did that get? And how many actually converted to clicking and going to your study website, right? So there's a conversion there from each of those different ads. And
Right.
then you got to also track from your study website, how many people read it and left, or read it, started the questionnaire, right? And then how many completed it and actually passed the questionnaire. And then of those, how many actually turned into actual screenings. And so you're right. So that's something that I think, especially biotech companies running online recruitment strategies, it is something that I've seen a lot of people try to tackle on Excel, because there's not really an easy way to bring all of that data together. Um, but it is critical. It is critical to measure that ROI so that perhaps you're spending, in a hypothetical example, if you're spending $100 a day on Google ads, Facebook ads, and Instagrams, there's going to be usually a clear winner on which one drives the most traffic to your study website. And however many then go on to do actual screening. And the obvious question for the biotech teams is you got to invest in digital strategies that work. And the only way to be able to make those decisions on making investments in the channels that work is knowing the conversion rates and knowing
Yeah.
how it changes.
Yeah. So this is
Great
sort of an
question.
aside. I'm not an expert at this. I'd be happy to talk to anybody if it brings up and I can point you towards some resource, certainly.
Yeah.
I just recently took a class on AI and marketing, and a lot of it
Yeah.
was the ability now to generate thousands of variations of an ad.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
the key metric, I mean, if you boil it all down, is what did we spend and how many people came out as a qualified trial participant, right?
Absolutely.
And the ability, the limiting thing is probably to test enough ads to really hone it in so that you get those rates optimized.
Right.
Anyway, I know enough to be dangerous, but I thought that was a fascinating thing
You know
that
quite a bit.
is now becoming possible
It is.
because you can have AI create so many variations, and I realize there are compliance things and probably other things to
Of
be
course, and
sorted out,
IRB
but
considerations.
yeah, but just to drive people into your funnel, lots of different opportunities.
Yeah, so the key takeaway is you need to know in order to make data-driven decisions and good decisions.
Exactly. Jen Kim, this has been a blast. Thank you for sharing your insights on this. I think I'm learning just about clinical ops in general, and
Yeah.
I'm really impressed with how you put this solution together. Can I mention, if I recall, I think I saw you post on LinkedIn. I mean, you started this business in your dorm room over the summer. Is that right?
Yep, so that was roughly 2.5, 3 years ago. Yeah, so after doing a couple of years of enterprise sales, selling analytic solutions to pharmaceutical and health companies, health systems, I did go back to school for grad school. And that's when I realized I've worked with a lot of the big pharma companies. I know how to build great software because I've studied computer science at MIT. And I'm very passionate about thinking about how can we improve at healthcare as having taken the MCAT and almost gone on to med school at some point. And so that summer was when it all kind of came together, and I just had to do something about all the experiences that I've been very fortunate to have.
Yeah. I just think it's a very cool story, and so you should be proud of what you've done, for sure.
We're just getting started, and I'm super excited for what's ahead.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Chris.
My pleasure.